Richard Halden was the kind of man who believed the world bent for him. Billionaire CEO of Halden Enterprises, his suits were custom-stitched, his cars black and polished, and his time too valuable to waste on anyone beneath his station. But there was one thing in life he hadn't mastered: his daughter. Clara was 10 years old, bright as sunlight but stubborn as fire. Richard tried to buy her happiness with toys, tutors, and expensive trips. Yet none of it worked. She was restless, hungry for something he didn't understand. One autumn afternoon, Richard's chauffeur waited by the curb of a busy park near his corporate headquarters. Richard sat in the back seat, scrolling through reports on his tablet, his mind occupied by profit margins. Clara had begged for a walk instead of being driven straight home. Richard, reluctantly, agreed to anything to stop her endless questions. But when she didn't return after 15 minutes, irritation flared. He stepped out of the car, ready to scold her. Then he saw it. Clara sat cross-legged on the pavement beside a thin, ragged-looking black girl about her age. The girl's clothes were torn, her shoes barely holding together, and yet she was writing numbers and words on the cracked sidewalk with a piece of chalk, explaining them to Clara with calm precision. Clara's eyes sparkled. Absorbed, Richard froze. His daughter being taught by a homeless child? For a man who thought he controlled every influence around Clara, the sight struck him like a blow. And then, before he could call her away, he heard the homeless girl's voice, steady, intelligent, almost melodic. No matter what they tell you, numbers don't lie. If you can see the pattern, you can solve the problem. Don't ever doubt yourself, Clara. Richard's world tilted. He didn't know it yet, but at that moment he saw his daughter learning from someone the world ignored, and his life had begun to change forever. Richard's jaw tightened as he marched toward the two girls. The chauffeur trailed behind, confused, unsure if he should intervene. "Clara!" Richard's voice cut through the autumn air. "What on earth are you doing down here?" Clara looked up, startled, chalk dust on her fingers. "Daddy, look! She's teaching me math problems I couldn't understand at school. Isn't it amazing?" Richard's gaze shifted to the other girl. She was small, fragile-looking, her hair tied back in uneven braids, eyes sharp and alert despite the hollowness in her cheeks. She lowered her gaze the moment his shadow loomed over her. Richard's tone hardened. "You don't belong here. Clara, get up this instant." Clara frowned. "But Daddy, she's smart. Smarter than my tutor. She explained fractions in a way I finally understood." Richard ignored his daughter and turned to the girl. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, then whispered, "Amara." "Well, Amara," Richard said, each syllable clipped, "you will not be speaking to my daughter again. Do you understand?" Amara swallowed hard but didn't answer. Clara leapt to her feet, indignant. "That's not fair! She's not doing anything wrong!" "Clara!" Richard snapped. "Get in the car now." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She grabbed Amara's hand. "If she can't come with us, then I won't go either." The chauffeur froze, wide-eyed. He'd never seen Clara defy her father so openly. Richard's face darkened. He was a man used to control, and his daughter's rebellion burned like humiliation. Yet behind Clara's stubborn little figure, Richard's eyes landed again on Amara. There was something in the girl's expression, something unyielding, something that reminded him of a time he'd long buried. But Richard shoved the thought aside. "Fine," he muttered coldly. "Have it your way. But mark my words, Clara, this ends now." Still, as he pulled his daughter away, he glanced back once more. Amara was still sitting on the pavement, chalk in hand, watching him leave with a look not of fear, but of quiet defiance. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The mansion's walls were tall, the gates even taller, but they couldn't cage Clara's restless spirit. Richard thought the matter was settled. After that day in the park, he forbade Clara from going anywhere near that girl. Tutors were doubled, activities scheduled tighter. Ballet, piano, science club, every hour filled, every minute accounted for. But Clara wasn't fooled. Her father could force lessons into her calendar, but he couldn't make her heart forget. She had never understood math so clearly as when Amara explained it with a piece of chalk on cracked pavement. There was something magical in the way the homeless girl taught, something no tutor with a polished accent ever gave her patience. So Clara began sneaking away. At first it was only once a week. She'd slip out of the mansion under the excuse of going to the library, the chauffeur none the wiser when she insisted she could walk a few blocks, then twice a week. Soon it became almost daily. Each time she found Amara in the same spot near the park with chalk in her hand, sketching on sidewalks or on scraps of cardboard. Sometimes Clara would bring snacks she stole from the mansion kitchen. Other times she carried big books, heavy ones Amara devoured with wide eyes. Amara taught Clara more than math. She taught her riddles, word puzzles, little tricks to memorize history. She spoke about the stars, the constellations she watched on cold nights from under bridges. One afternoon, Clara asked, "Amara, how do you know so much if you don't even go to school?" Amara shrugged, drawing circles on the pavement. "My mama taught me before she got sick, and when I couldn't go to school anymore, I just read whatever I found, books in trash bins, old newspapers. Sometimes I sit outside the library and listen through the window." Clara's throat tightened. For the first time, she realized her friend didn't just lack a home. She lacked everything Clara took for granted. "Amara," Clara whispered, "I wish you could come live with us. Daddy has so many rooms, no one would even notice." Amara smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "Your daddy would notice. People like him always do." Neither of them realized that across the street a black car was parked silently. Inside, Richard Halden sat in the back seat, having canceled a meeting to follow his daughter. He watched her laugh with the homeless girl. He watched her share food. He watched the way Clara's face lit up in a way it never did at home. And for the first time in years, Richard felt something he didn't quite recognize. Shame. Richard told himself he wasn't spying. He was protecting Clara. That was the excuse he whispered as he sat in the back of the car, watching his daughter spend hours with the homeless girl. But each time the excuse felt thinner. This afternoon he could no longer restrain himself. Clara was bent over a scrap of cardboard while Amara drew out an equation, her voice steady, her eyes alight with knowledge far beyond her years. Richard stepped out of the car. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the pavement. Both girls froze. Clara's chalk slipped from her hand. "Daddy," Richard raised a hand. "Go to the car, Clara." "No, Daddy, she's my friend, now." His tone was icy, and Clara's eyes filled with tears. But she obeyed, dragging her feet, glancing back at Amara with worry. Richard turned his attention to the girl. Up close, she looked even smaller. Her jacket was patched, her shoes torn, but her gaze was unwavering. "What exactly do you think you're doing with my daughter?" Richard demanded. Amara straightened, clutching the chalk stub like a sword. "Teaching her." Richard's brow furrowed. "Teaching her? You're a child yourself, homeless, barely surviving. What could you possibly have to teach her?" Amara's jaw tightened. "Maybe I don't have a mansion or money, but I have a brain, I have knowledge, and I can give that even if I have nothing else." Her voice didn't tremble. It was calm, certain. For a moment, Richard was thrown off balance. He expected shame, excuses, fear. Not this. Amara added quietly, "Besides, she listens. She believes she can do things when I explain them. Maybe no one's ever told her that before." Richard blinked. The words stung more than he cared to admit. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Yes," Amara said simply. "You're her father, the one who doesn't see her smile the way she smiles here." The silence stretched. Richard's polished facade cracked, just slightly, under the weight of the girl's words. Finally, he muttered, "Stay away from her." He turned, motioning to the car. "I won't warn you again." But as he walked away, the last thing he saw was Amara kneeling back down, picking up the chalk, as though she'd already moved on. And deep inside, Richard's chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. The next morning, Richard expected Clara to sulk in her room after yesterday's confrontation. Instead, she surprised him. At breakfast, she sat down holding her spoon, her face unusually serious. "Daddy," she said, "I'm not going to stop seeing Amara." Richard looked up from his phone, almost choking on his coffee. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Clara said, her small hands clenched into fists. "She's my friend. She makes me happy, and she teaches me things you don't even know how to explain." Richard's jaw tightened. "Clara, she's dangerous. She lives on the street." "People like that?" Clara cut him off, her voice trembling but firm. "She's smarter than my tutors, Daddy. She doesn't care about your money or your business. She cares about me." Richard froze. His own daughter had never spoken to him like this before. And you know what? Clara continued, her eyes filling with tears. She listens. She makes me feel like I matter. Not just as your daughter, not just as some heir, but as Clara. Her words struck Richard like blows. He opened his mouth but found no reply. Clara's spoon clattered against the table as she stood. You can take away my iPad. You can cancel my lessons. You can even lock me in my room. But as soon as I can, I'm going to see her again, because she's my friend, and I won't let you take her away from me. With that, Clara stormed out, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Richard sat there, stunned. The silence pressed against him. In all his years of commanding boardrooms, controlling empires, bending markets to his will, he had never felt so powerless. For the first time in a long time, Richard Harper, billionaire, did not know what to do. Richard Harper was a man who hated feeling out of control. Yet for the last 24 hours, he had been replaying his daughter's words on a loop. She makes me feel like I matter, not just as your daughter. It unsettled him. He could silence board members, politicians, competitors, but he couldn't silence the truth in his own child's eyes. That evening, as his car wound through the city on the way to a gala dinner, Richard noticed something unusual. At the corner of an old subway entrance, a small crowd had gathered. Some were laughing, others recording on their phones. "Slow down," Richard told his driver. As the car rolled closer, Richard spotted Amara. She was sitting on an overturned crate, surrounded by children, not just Clara this time, but a handful of other kids from the neighborhood. Some wore tattered jackets, others carried battered school bags. Amara was using nothing but a stick and chalk marks on the pavement to explain math problems. "Look at her," the driver chuckled softly. "That girl's got more patience than most teachers." Richard's chest tightened. The girl everyone dismissed as a homeless nobody was commanding the attention of children like a natural-born leader. She was solving equations, explaining ideas, encouraging them when they faltered. And the children, hungry, restless, overlooked, were drinking every word. Then Richard noticed something that froze him. Clara was there. She had slipped away from home, sitting cross-legged in the front row, hanging on to Amara's every word. Her face glowed in a way Richard hadn't seen in years. "Should I get her, sir?" the driver asked. Richard shook his head. "No, wait." For the first time in a long time, Richard didn't want to interrupt. He just watched. The lesson ended with Amara writing one final equation, then smiling as Clara raised her hand with the right answer. The crowd of children clapped. Amara's smile was radiant, proud not for herself but for them. Richard's heart tugged in a way he didn't expect. This wasn't a girl begging for pity. She was building something with nothing at all. But as the crowd dispersed, Richard noticed two police officers approaching. They were talking into radios, pointing at Amara. Richard's stomach dropped. "Sir, looks like someone complained," the driver said. "They don't like street gatherings around here." Richard had a choice: sit in his car and let the system swallow her up, or step out, for once in his life, without his title, without his money, and stand for someone who had no one. For a billionaire used to staying untouchable, it was the kind of choice that could change everything. The car sat idling. The tinted windows hid Richard, but his pulse pounded in his ears. He had always been the kind of man who let lawyers, assistants, or PR teams handle problems. But this wasn't business. This was his daughter's heart, her truth, staring him in the face. The officers approached Amara. One of them, tall and stocky, crossed his arms. "All right, miss, pack it up. You can't be out here blocking the sidewalk. Folks have been complaining." Amara's shoulders tensed, but she lifted her chin. "We're not blocking anything, sir. I'm teaching. These kids." "Teaching," the officer scoffed. "You don't have a permit. You don't have a license. What you do have is loitering." Clara leapt up, standing in front of Amara. "She's not hurting anyone. She's helping us. Leave her alone." "Clara!" Richard's voice cut across the street before he realized it. The driver's eyes widened in the rearview mirror. "Sir?" But Richard had already opened the door. He stepped out, expensive shoes hitting the cracked pavement, designer suit catching the glow of the streetlights. People in the crowd began whispering. Phones angled toward him. The officer frowned. "Sir, please step back. This doesn't concern you." "It does," Richard said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of authority that had silenced boardrooms for decades. "That young woman is doing more good on this sidewalk than most of us do in offices. If you arrest her, You'll be punishing the only person here actually investing in these children." The officer blinked. "Look, rules are rules." "No," Richard interrupted, locking eyes with him. "Rules are meant to protect people, not crush them. If you need a name to sign off, use mine. Richard Harper." The moment the name left his mouth, a ripple spread through the crowd. Whispers rose into gasps. Even the officers stiffened. They knew that name. Everyone knew that name. The second officer muttered to his partner, "That's Richard Harper? The one who owns." "Yes," Richard said, his voice rising, "and if anyone here has a problem with this girl teaching children, then your problem is with me." The taller officer shifted uncomfortably, his posture softening. After a long pause, he sighed. "All right, sir. We'll overlook this one. Just keep it moving soon, miss." They walked off. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some clapped softly. Others filmed with awe. Clara ran to her father, hugging him fiercely. "Daddy, you stood up for her." Richard's throat tightened as he looked over Clara's head at Amara. The girl's eyes were wide, wary, but filled with something he didn't expect: gratitude. For the first time in years, Richard Harper realized he hadn't just managed a situation. He had done the right thing, and somehow it felt better than any deal he had ever closed. The crowd slowly dispersed after the police left, though a few lingered, whispering about the shocking scene they had just witnessed. Clara clung to her father's arm, her face glowing with pride. Richard, however, was staring at Amara. She was standing a few feet away, still holding the piece of chalk she had been teaching with. Her eyes darted between him and Clara, suspicion written across her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was heavy. Finally, Amara broke the silence. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Her voice was low, cautious, as though she expected a hidden agenda. Richard cleared his throat. "Because you didn't deserve to be treated that way." Amara narrowed her eyes. "Men in suits like you don't usually care what happens to girls like me." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. Girls like me. He'd heard that phrase in 1,000 different forms across boardrooms, negotiations, charity galas. But here, in the mouth of a young homeless girl with chalk-stained fingers, it cut sharper than any business deal gone wrong. "You're right," Richard admitted softly. "Maybe we don't. Maybe I don't. But tonight I couldn't just sit there." Amara studied him, her expression unreadable. "You're Clara's father." Richard nodded. "Yes, and she thinks the world of you." That softened her for a second, though she quickly put her guard back up. "Clara's a good kid, different from most of the ones I meet." "She's lonely," Richard confessed, surprising even himself. "Her world is complicated, and I don't always know how to reach her." Amara crossed her arms. "You don't reach kids by throwing money at them. You listen, you sit with them, you show them they matter." Richard blinked. For a girl who slept under bridges and taught on sidewalks, she spoke with the authority of someone who had lived 10 lifetimes. Clara tugged at Amara's hand. "See, Daddy? This is what I mean. She gets it. She makes things simple." Richard let out a slow breath. "Amara, would you let me take you and Clara somewhere safe to talk? Maybe get something to eat?" Amara's shoulders stiffened. "Safe? You mean someplace where people won't stare at me? Where waiters won't ask me to leave once they realize I don't belong?" Richard hesitated. He realized she had probably been humiliated in more places than he could imagine. "Not this time," Richard said firmly. "If anyone dares, they'll have to answer to me." Amara searched his face, as though trying to detect a lie. After a long moment, she gave a small nod. "All right," she said, "but only because Clara's hungry." Clara grinned and squeezed her hand. As they walked toward Richard's sleek black car, the billionaire couldn't help but feel something stirring inside him. He wasn't sure what this night was turning into, but for the first time in years, Richard Harper was stepping into unfamiliar territory, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a man trying to understand a girl who had just shaken the foundations of his world. The black car slid silently through the city streets, neon lights bouncing off its polished frame. Amara sat stiffly in the back seat, her eyes darting around the luxurious leather interior. She looked like a bird perched in a cage that wasn't hers. Clara, however, leaned against her with ease, chatting nonstop. "And Daddy tried to help me with fractions once, but he gave up after 5 minutes. You explained it in, like, 2 seconds. You're amazing." Amara smiled faintly, but her gaze shifted to Richard, who sat opposite her. His phone buzzed with constant notifications, but for once, he ignored it. They pulled up to an upscale diner less flashy than Richard's usual haunts, but warm, with golden light spilling onto the sidewalk. Clara hopped out eagerly, pulling Amara along. Inside, the hostess froze the moment she saw Amara's worn clothes and messy braids. Her eyes flickered nervously to Richard's tailored suit. "Table for two, sir. 3, Richard corrected firmly. "And treat her," he gestured at Amara, "with the same respect you'd show me. Clear?" The hostess blinked, flustered. "Oh, of course, sir. Right this way." Amara's lips tightened. She said nothing, but her eyes told Richard she'd noticed every detail. They sat in a cozy booth. Clara eagerly ordered pancakes and hot chocolate. Richard ordered a steak. Amara hesitated, scanning the menu like it was written in another language. "Get whatever you want," Richard said gently. Her eyes flicked up. "You don't need to buy my silence." Richard leaned back, taken aback. "That's not what this is." Amara finally settled on the cheapest soup. When it arrived steaming and fragrant, she ate slowly, almost reverently, as though each spoonful was a luxury. Clara chatted happily, filling the space. But Richard couldn't take his eyes off Amara. Finally, he asked, "How did you end up out there, teaching kids on the street?" Amara set down her spoon, her shoulders stiffened. For a moment she seemed ready to shut down. But Clara touched her arm. "You can tell us, please?" Amara exhaled. "My mom used to say education was the only way out," she began quietly. "She worked 3 jobs so I could stay in school. She wanted me to be a teacher. But when she got sick, everything fell apart. Bills piled up, rent went unpaid. She didn't make it." Richard's chest tightened. After that, Amara continued, foster homes, shelters, nothing stuck. Some people saw me as trouble, others just didn't care. So I learned to survive. Books from libraries, lessons I remembered, and when I saw other kids slipping through the cracks, I thought, if no one else will teach them, I will. She looked up, her eyes fierce despite the tears brimming there. "I may not have a classroom, but the streets listen, and sometimes that's enough." The table went quiet. Clara reached for her hand. Richard's throat tightened. This girl, this homeless stranger, had just spoken words that cut deeper than any speech at a charity gala. He realized, with a pang of shame, that she had more purpose in her than he, with all his billions, had shown in years. For the first time in a long time, Richard Harper felt small. But alongside the shame came something else. Admiration, respect, and a growing conviction that maybe, just maybe, meeting this girl wasn't an accident. The diner buzzed around them with clinking glasses and low conversations, but Richard barely noticed. Amara's story echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. A girl who had nothing, yet gave everything she had to others. Meanwhile, he had everything, yet somehow gave nothing that mattered. He excused himself for a moment, stepping toward the restroom, but instead of going inside, he leaned against the cool tiled wall, running a hand over his face. His reflection in the mirror across the hallway stared back at him. A man in a $1,000 suit, polished shoes, perfect tie. To the world, Richard Harper was untouchable. But inside, he felt like a fraud. How many Amaras have I ignored? How many children like her slipped through the cracks while I threw money at problems and walked away? His phone buzzed again. A message from his assistant lit the screen. Urgent. Board expects update on contract by morning. Investor relations are shaky. Media digging into charity spending, requesting your comment. Richard's chest tightened. For years, he'd maintained a pristine image through carefully curated headlines and checks written at galas. Yet here he was, hiding in a diner, feeling more seen by a homeless girl than he ever had in a boardroom. He shut the phone off. For the first time in decades, business could wait. When he returned to the table, Clara was showing Amara a silly doodle she had made on a napkin. Both were laughing, their heads bent close together. The sight made something ache in Richard's chest. Amara noticed his return and quickly pulled back, as if reminding herself of the invisible line between their worlds. Richard sat down slowly. His voice was quieter than before. "Amara, you said something earlier, that you may not have a classroom, but the streets listen. That stuck with me." She raised an eyebrow cautiously. "What about it?" "You're right," Richard admitted. "The world doesn't need more people like me throwing money at problems. It needs people like you, people who care enough to stand in the cracks and hold the pieces together. Amara's lips pressed into a thin line. Care doesn't pay rent. Caring doesn't change the system. Richard hesitated. Maybe not alone, but with the right support, it could. Amara gave him a skeptical look. Support, huh? From people like you? The way she said it stung, but it was a fair question. Richard leaned forward, his voice low. Amara, if I told you I wanted to help not just you, but the children you teach, what would you say? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied him, her eyes sharp, searching for cracks in his sincerity. Finally, she said, I'd say I've heard that promise before. From teachers, from social workers, from people who meant well, but they always left. They always gave up. So if you're asking me to trust you, you'll have to prove it. Her words settled between them like a challenge. And for the first time in years, Richard felt something stir inside him, an unfamiliar fire, the kind that made him want to rise to a challenge not for profit, but for purpose. The ride back from the diner was quieter than before. Clara had fallen asleep, her head resting on Amara's shoulder. Amara, though clearly exhausted, stayed alert, her gaze fixed out the window, jaw clenched tight. Richard studied her in the dim glow of the streetlights. There was a resilience about her, a sharpness hardened by pain but softened by the way she held Clara so carefully. She looked more like a guardian than a street girl. When they arrived at the Harper estate, Richard hesitated. His home loomed ahead, massive gates opening automatically, lights flooding the driveway like a palace. Amara froze. I can't go in there, Richard frowned. Why not? She gave a bitter laugh. Because people like me don't belong in places like this. The last time I tried walking into a fancy neighborhood, a guard threatened to call the police. I don't need another reminder that I'm out of place. Richard's jaw tightened. You're not out of place here. Not tonight. Not with me. He opened the door and gestured. Come. Amara hesitated but followed, carrying the sleeping Clara gently in her arms. The sight of this homeless girl cradling his daughter as if she were her own made something shift inside Richard. Inside the mansion, staff rushed forward, startled by Amara's presence. One maid whispered, Sir. Richard cut her off with a firm hand. She's a guest. Treat her with respect. The staff scattered. Amara lowered Clara carefully onto the couch, covering her with a blanket. Then she stood, arms crossed, her eyes sharp. All right, she said flatly. You wanted to talk? Let's talk. Richard nodded, motioning toward the sitting room. They sat opposite each other, the silence heavy. Finally, he spoke. Amara, I meant what I said earlier. I want to help you. And the children you've been teaching. You've been doing the work of 10 schools by yourself. If I could fund a program. Her hand shot up. Stop. Richard blinked. Money isn't the answer, Amara said coldly. It never is. People think throwing money at something fixes it, but it doesn't. You can build a center, hire teachers, print flyers, but unless someone actually cares enough to be there every single day, it falls apart. I've seen it happen. Richard leaned forward. Then tell me, what would make a difference? Amara's eyes hardened. Consistency. Commitment. Someone showing up when they say they will. Someone not giving up when it gets messy. That's what changes lives, not a fat check. Her words hit him like bullets. For a moment, Richard was silent. Then, almost without thinking, he said, Then I'll show up. Amara blinked. What? I'll come, Richard repeated. Not just once. Not just for a photo op. I'll come with you. I'll sit in your lessons. I'll meet those kids. I'll be there. Amara stared at him like he'd lost his mind. You? A billionaire CEO, sitting on the sidewalk with chalk and milk crates? Yes, Richard said firmly. If that's what it takes to prove I'm not just another man making empty promises. For the first time that night, Amara's guarded expression faltered. She searched his eyes, looking for the lie, the angle, the transaction, but she didn't find one. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, We'll see. The next afternoon, Amara sat on the cracked pavement, holding a chalk in her hand, a half circle of children waiting eagerly for their lesson. Clara sat in the front row, grinning from ear to ear. Amara's mind, however, was restless. He won't come. Not a man like that. Billionaires don't sit on sidewalks. She forced herself to focus, writing an equation on the ground. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a sleek black car pull up. Her heart skipped. The door opened. Out stepped Richard Harper, not in his usual tailored suit, but in jeans, a plain shirt, and sneakers. Still expensive, of course, but stripped of the armor he usually wore. The crowd went silent. Phones lifted. Whispers spread like wildfire. Is that really him? Richard Harper? What's he doing here? Richard walked toward the circle of children and, without hesitation, lowered himself onto a crate beside Clara. "Hope I'm not late," he said, trying to smile. Clara clapped. "You came, Daddy!" Amara stared at him, stunned. She had expected excuses, delays, maybe even a quiet check in the mail. But here he was on the sidewalk, in front of everyone. She swallowed. "All right then, Mr. Billionaire. Let's see if you can handle fractions." The kids giggled. Richard chuckled nervously but leaned in. For the next hour, he stumbled through problems, laughed at his mistakes, and watched in awe as Amara explained concepts with clarity and patience. And for the first time in years, Richard wasn't a CEO. He wasn't a billionaire. He was just a man, learning beside his daughter, respecting the wisdom of a girl who had been written off by the world. News spread fast. By the end of the week, photos of Richard Harper sitting on the sidewalk with homeless kids had gone viral. Headlines exploded. Billionaire CEO joins street classroom. Harper's surprising new mission. Reporters swarmed, critics speculated, but Richard didn't care. For once, the noise didn't matter. What mattered were the kids showing up day after day, hungry to learn. Amara, though, kept her guard. Even as Richard returned consistently, she challenged him at every turn. "Don't think showing up twice makes you different," she muttered one evening as they packed up. Richard looked her in the eye. "Then I'll show up 3 times, or 30, as many as it takes." For the first time, she didn't argue. Weeks turned into months. Together, Amara and Richard began building something bigger. With her guidance and his resources, they rented an old community hall. Amara refused fancy renovations. She wanted it humble, accessible. Soon, the hall buzzed with children. Volunteers joined, books filled shelves, desks replaced crates. And at the heart of it all, Amara stood, teaching with the same fire she had on the sidewalk. Richard often sat in the back, watching, learning, and sometimes stepping in, not as a boss, but as a partner. Clara thrived, her laughter ringing louder than ever. One evening, after the last child had left, Amara looked at Richard. "You really stayed." Richard smiled softly. "I told you, I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes glistened. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe him. Years later, the community center had become a beacon of hope. Thousands of children had passed through its doors, their futures forever changed. Amara, once homeless, was now its director, her vision shaping lives on a scale she had never dreamed possible. And Richard? He was no longer just a billionaire CEO. He was a man transformed. His empire still thrived, but now his legacy wasn't measured in profits. It was measured in lives touched, in futures rebuilt, in a daughter who grew up knowing her father had chosen compassion over pride. One evening, as Richard watched Amara teaching a new class, Clara whispered beside him, "Daddy, she didn't just change me, she changed you too." Richard's throat tightened. He nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, she did." Amara often said she never needed riches, she needed someone to believe in her. Richard had been that someone, but in truth, she had given him more than he had ever given her. Because in choosing to fight for a homeless girl with chalk-stained fingers, Richard Harper had discovered something money could never buy: redemption, purpose, and a life worth living. And for once, the billionaire didn't feel empty. He felt whole. If this story of how a billionaire's life was forever changed by the courage of a homeless girl touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Colorless Voices, because sometimes the greatest wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we choose to lift when the world looks away.